Well, hello, horror fans, and welcome to the first recorded, not the first published, but the first recorded episode of 2022. If you have listened to the bumper, the little short trailer that Matt Donato and I put together, then you recognize that things have changed a little bit around the certified forgotten parts. We are no longer beholden to 5 or fewer reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. We have allowed for inflation. We're allowing our guests to bring us reviews with 10 or fewer reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. We got to change with the times. We got to stay competitive and modern. It's how we do. But we're still going to be talking to some amazing guests going forward, and we're still going to be shining a light on some movies that I promise you haven't seen. Donato, does that sound right? Does that all sound true and factual to you?
Yeah, I think that sounds very true and factual because it really was today's episode that had me even bring that up to you, Mr. Monagle, because I do believe very much that there are a lot of titles. Hilariously, just the change of 5 single reviews. Like we went from 5 critic reviews to 10 critic reviews. Like that is such a small margin. But after looking through Rotten Tomatoes and looking at some of the movies that we now have available to us for the podcast, like even that small a change still blew the door wide open. Like it's so funny to me that it seems so insignificant, and yet now it's going to be so much easier for guests to pick a movie.
And it sounds silly, but the number of times a guest has come with us, like this movie, and said, "I have something with 6 reviews. Can I do that?" The difference between 5 and 6. I mean, it's what happens when you arbitrarily choose parameters for a podcast. Eventually, you're like, "Okay, maybe we can relax these a little bit."
And so does the Donato rule go into effect now for 11 reviews? Because the Donato rule officially was if I was the 6th review on something, as I was often, then we were allowed to do it for the podcast. So I guess that makes my Donato rule 11 now.
I think it's our little fiefdom, and we can do whatever we want with it.
It's our weird little kingdom.
And what we would like to do today is talk about a really fun sci-fi horror movie with a really awesome guest. Donato, introductions, please.
Absolutely. My guest needs no introduction. I know we say that every time, but you know this person as the managing editor of Daily Dead, and you also know this person as an author for such books as Monsters, Makeup, and Effects, as well as just being everywhere on the internet talking about horror. You know Heather Wixson very well, and now Heather, please say hello.
Hello. Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm excited to be the first to kick the door open on the 5 review rule.
Yeah, you know what? We're going to change it eventually, but we weren't going to do the first episode for just anybody. So I'm really glad that it's you and that you're here and bringing us a cool title, which of course we'll get to in a moment. But you can read episode titles on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, so you know what this is already. But Heather, as we do with all of our guests, we really want to talk a little bit about you because I feel like as somebody who's seen you on Twitter before, seen kind of like the things that you're advocating, you spend a lot of time talking about other people's work in a lot of really great and interesting detail. But I want to spend a little bit of time talking about your work in that same amount of detail. So start us off by talking about kind of those early days of horror fandom for you. What do you remember as sort of those formative memories that made you connect to the genre?
I mean, I think I was lucky because I think I'm a little bit older than you guys. So I grew up with a single mom who basically took me to everything. So like one of my very first like memories is seeing American Werewolf in London in a theater at like age 3. So I've already dated myself. So yes, I'm a little bit older. Me and Halloween, we share a birthday, so to speak, or at least a birthday year.
Mm.
And I think that was the kind of the best time to grow up because I think parents just kind of were like, watch whatever. And so like my best friend and her parents were super into science fiction. So when we were really young, like her parents were watching movies like The Thing and Alien and like scaring the crap out of us. Because I think I saw The Thing at like age 5, which I don't recommend because it terrified me in terms of dogs. I was just absolutely petrified of all dogs because of that movie. So it was just kind of like pretty much it was like most kids who grew up in the 80s. Like I would just go to video stores, find what's cool, and rent it. But I will say one of the biggest things that sort of became, and I didn't even realize like how formative it was at the time, but I see it now. One of my discoveries was pretty early on. I discovered Terror in the Isles, which is now gotten like a Blu-ray from Scream Factory, but for years nobody knew what that was. And it's a really fun sort of compilation, project where it has Donald Pleasance and Nancy Allen hosting all these movie clips in a movie theater. It has Donald Pleasance saying werewolf in the most adorable way possible. But the cover of it is like a skull and it has all these movie titles in it. And so I would take that artwork and that's how I would start finding movies. And I would like, oh, okay, I need to go find Suspiria. And at age 8, my best friend and I rented Suspiria. Again, do not recommend it. It's not a movie I'd show a lot of 8-year-olds.
Mhm.
But yeah, so that was kind of like my introduction to it. And then I think it really started to click for me. Like I think around the time of like discovering like Nightmare on Elm Street and just starting to kind of get into these franchises. I fell in love with Freddy far before I fell in love with like the Friday 13th movies, or even the Halloween movies. But, I will say, for as roughshod as like a childhood you had back then, we didn't have helmets or anything like that. We just kind of did our thing. But like, I don't know that I would have grown up the fan that I was, without sort of having that kind of freedom. But I was the weird kid who, because girls back then, like, we were supposed to be super into Barbies and stuff like that. And I was the kid who liked professional wrestling and horror, which doesn't exactly make you super popular.
Well, I feel like now, if I've learned anything from Twitter, it's that wrestling and horror are like, honey and chocolate. They just go together perfectly, and it's almost impossible to find somebody who's a really diehard fan of one without the other. So you were just ahead of your time, is what I'm
I
saying.
was. It was funny because like I kept thinking about that because even like when I started dating my partner, like because we met in 2009 when I first moved out here, and I don't even think we talked about it initially because we met actually at a Friday 13th party, but we were on our first date and it was like we went to a movie and then afterwards we were having drinks and he said something about wrestling and I was like, "Wait, you like wrestling?" Because like 13 years ago nobody talked about it. So I didn't know that like it was okay to talk about wrestling because I'd spent so many years being made fun of for my love of wrestling that I was like, "Wait, this is okay. This is cool." And so yeah, for me, like getting to see everybody now on Twitter, like really embracing both of these things, like it feels like I found my people finally. Like I've just only been waiting, I've been waiting decades to find them, and there they are on Twitter.
It's so funny because I was the wrestling fan first from a much younger age when I wasn't like allowed to be the horror fan in a way, in my family and in my household. It was just, as I always say on the podcast, like I grew up with my helmet on, to what you said, Heather, before. Like, I
Mhm.
was in the generation of people who had to wear their helmet, and my parents were very rule abiding and they saw horror as a certain thing. But for some reason, I was allowed to watch WCW and WWF. And so, like, I was the wrestling kid for a little while. Then that fell off when WCW went away. It was just WWF and they went to WWE. And I was like, I'm done with this. I don't like where things are going, blah, blah, blah. And then I became the horror fan. And then all of a sudden, like, the funny intersection of being like, wait, all these horror people keep talking about wrestling. Like, what have I been missing? And it was horror fans that brought me back in to like AEW, like specifically Amelia Emberwing. But like that funny intersection of being wrestling first, then all of a sudden I'm the horror fan and not the wrestling fan. It's so funny to
Mhm.
me. It's so funny to look back on.
Yeah, it was one of those things. Like when I was a kid, like my aunt was obsessed with Ric Flair. Like she had pictures of him on her wall, like she had pictures of her kids, like in frames, like it was ridiculous. But so I would like if we were over there like on a weekend or and just kind of visiting with her, like she always had like NWA and stuff like that on. And it makes me kind of sad and feel very old, Matt, that you're talking about the years when like WCW went away because that was like when I was in my 20s and I kind of got back into wrestling. So now I feel even older. But I remember that whole thing. I remember I was actually it was a really good time to be a wrestling fan in the early 2000s, because one, I got to do like a lot of really cool stuff. Like my first Mania was WrestleMania 18, so I was there, and I know Hogan's not a great person, but like I was there for Hogan versus Rock, which was like my two generations of fandom like colliding in one place, and I've never heard anything like that in my life. And I also got to go to like 19 and 20, and I was there when NWO came back and things like that because they did that in Milwaukee, and I'm originally from Chicago, and I was even there when Hogan and The Rock had their first sort of meeting because they did that in Chicago, and it was like the night when like The Rock was in the ambulance and they NWO smashed it. It was just yeah, it was a wonderful time to be a fan. So yeah, I definitely don't feel old or anything right now, but
It wasn't my intention, I promise.
no, it's totally okay. But I think I think that's what's really cool. It's like I think both of these things because they're sort of outlier like entertainments. I think that's why there is such an overlap because, I think they're both sort of on the fringes where we have to kind of fight for our fandom a little bit.
Hmm.
And I think that's why they're such like, they kind of are really compatible in a lot of ways. Plus, if you look at like some of like the old stuff that they did in WWF back before they became WWE, like there's a lot of really good horror type characters. I mean, the Undertaker alone is like probably one of the most iconic figures in wrestling history, and he's like a dead guy. So it makes sense. But yeah, I just think it's really cool that like, especially now being a fan of wrestling, like there's just so many different options because like, we also follow AEW, we also follow GCW, we follow AAW, New Japan, like it's kind of exhausting, like the amount of stuff I have to consume between wrestling and like work stuff where I'm like,
Hmm.
I'll get to a night and I'll be like, wait, we don't have to watch anything. This is great. So, but yeah, I just think it's really fun how those things, I never expected them to overlap, but I am all for it. Like I'm just, it's nice to kind of be able to live free because I remember because I was actually married before I moved out here. And like my ex's family, like his grandfather, he was really sweet, and I don't think he meant anything malicious, but he used to send these, like, you're a redneck if, like, he used to like do like clippings of like newspapers and calendars and stuff, and he'd always send the wrestling ones to me because he thought it was funny. But I just was like, oh, okay, like you tape over
Hmm.
you're a redneck if you tape over your wedding video with a wrestling show, and I'm just like, oh, okay.
Is it
So
targeted?
I know. I was like, wow, okay. But I never did tape over the wedding video with that. So I think I threw it away. But yeah, it's just, I think I've always just sort of gravitated to the stuff that most people I don't think really necessarily did. But then again, when I started watching wrestling, like a lot of people weren't into it, but then like Hogan, exploded in the 80s, and then suddenly it became a mainstream thing, which was really cool. And then when you got to get wrestlers into movies, like forget about it. I was in
Hmm.
heaven.
I've always wondered, as somebody who is not a fan of wrestling, doesn't follow it outside of a few years I had with what is it, NCO versus NWO Revenge, the old N64 game.
Hmm.
Um, I always wondered, there's got to be something there between like the um, iconic horror killer and the wrestling icon, because there's an element of pageantry, there's an element of camp, there's like this permutations of folding narratives and storylines where eventually it could collapse under its own mythology, but it's also great at the same point. And like everything kind of bends around these iconic characters. I always feel like, when people are like, oh, I love Nightmare on Elm Street and I love wrestling, I'm like, it's got to be the Freddy thing. We're all just chasing that Freddy high in
Yeah.
inside and outside of the ring forever.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think too, like, when I was a kid, like the bad guys in wrestling were sometimes genuinely scary. Like I remember Zeus coming in, and bless Tiny Lister Jr., like he wasn't a wrestler, he wasn't great in the ring, but he scared the crap out of me. And I know a lot of that came from seeing No Holds Barred, but like his character carried over really well. And I remember when he popped up, in WWF, like I was genuinely terrified. I thought he was going to kill Hulk Hogan. And when you're a kid, and
Hmm.
back then when you idolize somebody like that, like you're like, oh, like you feel like somebody's in jeopardy, and you feel like you're watching like that version, like a version of a horror story, where it's like they have to conquer the bad guy, or be forever, dealt with, or I don't want to say, dead, because it's not like Hulk Hogan die, but
Right.
yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. I think we all, I think for most of us in horror, like we all like the good people, and we like good to prevail, but there's something to be said for a really great bad guy.
Hmm.
I mean, like for me, it was Kane. You know, the Undertaker obviously is go-to horror wrestling intersection, but like Kane was the one that scared me. The mask, just everything about it, like having
Oh,
no voice
interesting.
for a little bit, but like just the imposition and seeing him, that was enough for me to be like, he's the scariest mofo in wrestling right now. That was the one for me. But I mean, it also goes back to slasher killers are essentially like cutting promos half the time. Like if you look at their
Yeah.
monologues and thing like that, they're basically doing what heroes and heels do in wrestling. And Chucky wasn't on WCW. Like he cut a promo on WCW because that's what he can do well. Like he can
Hmm.
yell at Rick Steiner and be like, "Yo, like I'm with your boy Scott. Like I'm gonna kill you in the ring if I come out there." And like it's just so hilarious to see that intersection come full circle because they are the same thing in so many aspects. Just, everyone has the personality, everyone is playing a character, just the way that a slasher villain is playing a character and all these things.
Yeah, if anybody could take down the Steiners, I think it is Chucky.
Oddly enough, yes, I agree.
Well, let me skip forward a little bit then, Heather, and ask you a bit about the beginning of your writing career, because I know, in reading through your bio and looking at your prodigious amount of bylines and past writing you've done, that you've been doing this for a long time. And I'm kind of curious, especially, kind of in the earlier days of what we think of as, like, I don't want to say film Twitter, but like the writing communities that have popped up over the last 20 years or so, how you broke into that, how you connected to other writers during that period, and what sort of inspired you to turn your voice to horror.
I mean, I think it was because I was sort of at a point in my life when I didn't feel like I had anything that was my own. Like, I got married pretty early in my 20s, and I was doing everything you were supposed to be doing. Like, I had a steady office job, I had a house and cars, and we vacationed, and all these things that traditionally you're told you're supposed to do, when you're growing up. And but I kept, like, just feeling like something was off. And I always loved writing, but I ended up getting, like, typical office jobs because I was good at that stuff and I could make money and things like that. But
Mhm.
I really always missed writing because it was a passion of mine. Like, I remember I was writing stories like when I was like 5 or 6 years old. My best friend, at her house, they had a typewriter, and regularly I was running their typewriter tape out because I was just always over there doing stuff. Like, I was a weird kid. Like, they'd be out there playing and I'd be like, oh, but I'm writing a story, I'll be out like in 20 minutes. Um and so I missed that. I felt like I just didn't have that part of me. And I tried, like, working for, like, local papers in the area, out there, like, in the Chicago suburbs. And it was fine, but it's like you can only get so excited about, like, covering, like, oh, they're installing new sidewalks in a subdivision. Yay. How do you make that interesting? You just don't. And I, but I didn't know what I wanted to do with that. Like, I knew I loved horror movies, I knew I loved writing, but this was like 2007, so I'm like, I don't know exactly what that means. And the idea of writing about this stuff professionally seemed like so foreign to me. And I remember, because I used to go to this convention back when I lived in Chicago, which I'm really fortunate that I actually get to go back and co-host now. But I was sitting at Flashback Weekend, and it was 2007, and Adam Green was there promoting Hatchet. And he was telling his very famous D. Snyder story, which, if you watch the special features for Hatchet or even Frozen, he talks about it. So it's, basically D. Snyder kept inspiring him to follow his dreams for years. And he did. And then for the premiere of Hatchet, D. Snyder showed up and took him on the red carpet. And, and Adam was sitting there talking. He's a guy who, like, had to find a way to make a movie. He didn't have he was doing his shorts and things like that through the early days of Aeroscope. But, Hatchet was a really big deal for him. And I remember him saying something to the effect of, like, if you're passionate about something, find a way to do it. And to be really honest, and it's not like I want to, like, bag on my ex or anything, but I'm sitting there in this convention and my marriage is already falling apart at this point. And I'm just feeling lost. I'm feeling found because I'm at a horror convention, but I'm ultimately lost and I don't know what to do. And I knew I needed something. And just on a whim, like a week or two later, I was looking on Craigslist and I found this posting on there for, like, this new upcoming horror website that was looking for people to do reviews. And I was like, whatever, I'll just take a shot. Let's see what happens. And Fabian, who owned the site at the time, reached out to me. He's like, yeah, let's do this. And so I wrote my very first review in August of 2007, which was, I believe, The Invasion, the Nicole Kidman, Daniel Craig movie, which I don't remember really liking, but my goal is to go back and review some of the movies that I saw back in, like, that first year, because I'm curious if things have changed a little bit. I don't read my writing from back then because it's awful. I did that once and I was like, oh no. I was like, that was a bad thing. But yeah, so I just kind of, and so I started doing that. And at the time, it was one of these things where, like, I had a day job. We were kind of dealing with the fallout of, once we got into, like, 2008, we had a bunch of, like, weird things happen where, like, we were having a house built. We had to move into this house. We still had a house because we couldn't sell it because of the real estate, like, basically the whole market collapsing. So essentially, like, I was, for like a year and a half, I was basically working a day job. I was working part-time at Super Target. And then I was also writing, and then I used to also do these jewelry parties on the weekends for this company called Leah Sophia. So I was like doing a lot. I don't know if you can tell, but I kind of work a lot. If you ever see my stressed out tweets, I have a tendency to work too much. But I was also paying for divorce, trying to pay mortgages on 2 houses, things like that. Um, and I was just like, something has to give. And it sort of worked out in a way that I didn't see it at the moment, but I realized my boss was doing me a favor because I'd gone to Sundance on my own dime in 2009. And the reason I did is because Adam had produced a movie that was playing there. And I'd been covering it like sort of for Terra2, which is the first site that I worked for. And I was like, I wanted to see it through to completion. Like I wanted to see the movie get to play there. So I like sold a bunch of jewelry to all the ladies at my office so I could pay for my airfare and my car rental. And, I basically took myself out there. I bought tickets. There's no way I was getting press passes or anything like that. And I just went. And when I was there, that was when Steve Barton, who used to be the head guy over at Dread Central, he reached out to me. Actually, it was the night that I was packing to head back to Chicago. And he was like, hey, do you want to do some stuff for us? The irony being that 2 months earlier, he'd put out a call for people to write for Dread Central, and I responded, but he never responded back to me.
Mm.
Yep.
And then I thought it was funny, like 2 months later, he's like, hey, we could use some Sundance stuff if you want to do things. And I was like, oh, okay. But that was kind of how the door sort of opened for me in terms of being able to get my work on a new level and being seen by people. And, essentially about a month after going to Sundance, I ended up getting fired from my job, which was the first time I'd ever been let go. And so I decided to I'd already had a trip booked to LA for my birthday. And I was like, well, I'm just going to throw out some resumes, see what happens. And I got a call as I was boarding my plane to come to LA from a school here. And they were like, oh, would you want to come in for an interview? And basically during my vacation, I ended up getting a job out here. And so I had to go home, pack everything up in like 5 days and move. And I think about that now and how ridiculous it is. And I'm like, I would never do that again. Because that's crazy. And so it was like I had like 5 cats at the time. I left one at my mom's permanently, but I had to bring 4 out like a month later and with my car and everything. And it was just, I still look at, I'm like, what did I do that? Like, that is crazy. And I was really lucky to have friends here who they let me crash at their place while I figured everything out. I was able to have the day job, which is why I see a lot of folks who try to get down on people who have day jobs and try to write and things like that. But ultimately, that's most of us. Like most of us are hustling outside of this, because it isn't exactly like we're all swimming around in our yachts, or not swimming, but floating around in our yachts because we're making bank, writing about some obscure horror movie that means a lot to us, but maybe, isn't going to make us $30,000 just because we wrote something really cool. So,
To be fair, my hypothetical yacht would have a pool, so swimming around in our yachts would be an accurate statement.
Yeah, I feel like that's safer because you don't know what's in the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
I've watched Jaws enough to know that I mean, contained water is sometimes the best water.
Correct.
But yeah, and so and it was just trying to figure out as I went. But it was interesting because back then, when I started, I can count on one hand the amount of women writers that I knew of. There wasn't many. If there was myself, there was Stacey Wilson, Yovanka. I'm trying to think of who. Oh, Stacey Ponder was another one. Heidi Martinuzzi was doing some stuff at that point. So for me, I think the coolest thing that I've seen, in the last 15 years, which I still can't believe it's been almost 15 years now, is the evolution of everything, because it did feel very insular when I started. Like you really had to kind of work to get in with people. And now it just feels really, for the most part, inviting, which is nice. Because we're all here for the same reasons, because of the things that we love and what we love doing. And so that's why I always encourage people, don't cut people off. If you're into something and they're into something, that's reason enough to have a conversation. I still remember my boss now, Jonathan, over at Daily Dead, because I joined there in 2013. His first Comic-Con, I think, was 2011. And I had just started following Daily Dead, and I saw him, I think it was the Silent Hill 2 press conference, and we were sitting there and chit-chatting, and when I started at Daily Dead, he's like, I wanted to tell you this. He's like, but that was my first Comic-Con. And he was like, not a single person talked to me the entire Comic-Con. Like no other journalists would even say a word to him. And he was like, you're the only person that talked to me. And I was like, what? It's like, that's crazy to me. Like things don't need to be that way. And I think they're better now. But even, just looking at like 10 years ago, I'm like, really? Like that's how people were? So it kind of bummed me out a little bit. But I just, I'll talk to anybody. So I'm going to shut up now because I've been rambling a lot. But yeah, like that's sort of the short version. If this is the movie Clue, I'd be like, long story short, and then everybody would say too late. But yeah, I'm just really fortunate. I'm somebody who's loved writing as much as I've loved horror for most of my life. And I just feel, it's stressful. There are days where I just kind of want to give up. And I've come close, but I'm still grateful. Like I'm still grateful for the things I get to do, for the opportunities that I have, and that I get to celebrate a genre that I love.
Yeah, I think the hardest parts for me right now are the you mentioned going to festivals and conventions and how things have gotten better, and how like that's where I find my most fulfillment doing this job. Me and Monagle are both the day job critics. Like literally, we're probably have our work emails open right now as we
On the other screen, there's an important email chain that popped up in the middle of the podcast, so I'm sort of like, I'm gonna be like, oh, I gotta answer that as soon as we're done here.
But that's the thing, though. Like, it's that new normal, because the idea of being a film critic and just getting paid a living wage to be a film critic is now a thing that like doesn't exist. I think a decade ago when I started, it did, and every site had a dedicated film critic and all these things. But between so many happenings, like either A, you are doing everything now, and like you should. There is no being just a critic anymore. If you're going to be staff anywhere, you have to do everything that's imaginable in that like white unicorn position of just being a chief film critic, and that's it. Like it's not how this goes anymore. But like that's not necessarily a bad thing either. Like that's not a complaint by any means. It's just I think that if you are if you have a day job and you're doing this on the side, it is because you want to write about what you want to write about. Horror, particular, does not pay very well. I'm sorry to burst a lot of bubbles out there, but that doesn't mean that like you're any less of a writer or critic because you have that day job. Like I'm sorry, my day job is very comfortable and it gives me a nice living salary and it lets me live in LA to do all the things that I want. And it's like, if you're going to turn your nose down at that, like that's just as big an issue as turning down your nose at any journalist you meet for the first time at a festival. And like my first my first Fantastic and South by were largely just me alone. So like I totally understand that. Like, when I started, I think like 2014 was like the first festival runs for me. I didn't know anyone out there in the big old world outside my little bubble. So it's like you got to go out. You got to just go find your way. And as you were talking about, Heather, it's like you had to do it yourself. Like all these people ask, like, well, why do you get to go to festivals? It's like, what do you mean? Why do I get to go? Like I kind of just go. like it's like one of those things where like obviously you have to get the press credentials and things of that nature, but I don't know. It's about putting yourself out there, and if you don't put yourself out there, you're not going to get as much back.
Yeah, I will say though, for many, many years of me starting in this industry, like I didn't make anything.
Yeah.
Like I'll be perfectly honest. Like I was at Dread Central, and this was during the days where Dread was making like money.
Yep.
I didn't get paid. I should have been getting paid, but I didn't. But that was little oversight on my part that I should have maybe fought for myself. But I was just grateful to get my foot in the door and be able to do something like that. And it did open a lot of doors for me. Like, I mean, now it's like I've written stuff for Fangoria, which I never in a million years would have imagined. Like I still remember crying the first issue of Fangoria, and I saw like my name in there, and I was like, oh my God, 8-year-old me would be freaking the hell out right now, because like, what is this? So I know a lot of people, the whole, don't want to get paid an experience, and like I get it, but also at the same time, like if you're just starting out, sometimes you do have to pay your dues, and it sucks. And you'll know where the line is for yourself, where you're like, okay, this is getting me experience. And then you'll know where the line is where you're like, okay, this is when I need to start getting money for what I'm doing. And again, I don't mean to like discount people, because it's like, yes, everybody should be getting paid, but also like most of the sites out there, like, we're all doing our best. Because especially with after the pandemic, like things just dried up so completely for so many sites. It's been rough, but I think, I think ultimately, if nothing else, what's intrigued me about the pandemic is just being able to see people evolve a bit. And I think podcasts too have really been a crucial part of that because one, it's given people new opportunities, but also I think gives people an escape, the listeners. You know what I mean? Where they maybe wouldn't have had time or wouldn't have thought like, to sit and listen to people chat for an hour about a silly movie or something like that. But now they're like, oh, that's like my 1 hour of escape that, for any given day. So I was just also, by the way, Matt, I was like trying to think of what 2014 South by Southwest was. And I don't think I was actually at that one, which just because that was the 1 year I didn't go because it was my first year at Daily Dead. And I was like still getting set up there. And I was like, I don't think I was at that one. So I'm sorry. If I was there and I would have seen you, Matt, I would have chatted with you.
I appreciate it. We met later. We did meet. I think it was like maybe even a year or two later. It was not long after.
I think the first time we met I think it was at the Hardcore Henry junket, I want to say.
Possibly could have been it.
Yeah, it was like sitting in that like weird little house.
Yeah. It was like the Fonz PR house at the time or something.
Yeah, that was like so different. I always like, having different experiences. And then I remember like really getting to chat with you when they did the free fire.
Oh, right. The free fire paintball where we shot Sheralto with paintballs.
Yes. And they gave us like tons of like clothes from Goodwill, which I still have because there are some cool t-shirts.
Oh, I still have mine too. I have it sitting right over next to me, like right now.
That's awesome.
Yeah, Donato and I have talked about the writer path and the professional versus, the people that are doing it for the passion and what that means for you and where you should draw that line. I don't think there's a lot of copywriters that are like, oh, I just, I can't believe that I get paid to write copy. It's like, you should probably have a little bit more of that mindset too. As writers, we could all stand to maybe recognize the business value of our trade. It's complicated. It's individual. It really is going to vary depending on what else you have going on, how much time and devotion you kind of allow yourself to give to the industry. But it's for every guest that we've had on here, for no matter their experience level, no matter the amount of time that they've been doing this, there isn't really like an easy answer other than maybe, have been born in the 1950s and be able to work through the 70s and 80s. I guess that's the closest thing we got.
Yeah, or get like one of those cushy like staff jobs at the like a major newspaper and been there for like 35 years or something.
Yeah.
So.
The best way to be a professional film critic is to have already been a professional film critic. There we go.
Yeah, there is no future path forward for what used to be, and I think we'll all be better to realize that it's a business and it's a creative industry, but it's both.
Yeah,
and you can't just think it's one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, okay, so that got to a little bit of a heavy place.
Yeah, dark.
Sorry, I apologize.
No, it wasn't just you. Donato, I think, did most of the heavy lifting on the dark front.
Just call me the Debbie Downer of podcasting. Sorry.
Wow.
No, this is not the first time we've gotten here in an episode. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take just a short little break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about Alien Raiders, and then all the cynicism and all of this pessimism is going to drain right the fuck away. So join us. We'll be back in just a second with Alien Raiders. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the middle section, the bumper section of Certified Forgotten. You are about to hear some of our patrons make us answer questions, promote their work. I actually don't know what we have in store for us today. So we're lucky enough to have an incredible community of people who support the writers for CertifiedForgotten.com and support this podcast. We like to take time out of every episode to give them a little bit of a voice on the show. So Matt Donato, who are we hearing from today?
The very first we are hearing from is Mr. Ian. And he asks, what is one of your favorite horror watches from last year? It does not have to be something that was released last year, just something maybe you watched and you want to share with everyone. So Mr. Monagle, I'm going to let you go first.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I had sort of a month of horror. I got halfway through October where I watched a new, to me, horror movie every day. Maybe the best movie that I watched, new or otherwise, in October or in 2021 was The Invitation. But that's not the one that I'm going to shout out. The one I want to shout out is My Bloody Valentine. Not the remake, although if you want opinions on the remake, I happen to know a guy who does a column on classic horror remakes. But yeah, I'm not really a slasher guy. It's not a genre that I've ever gotten behind. I've seen a lot of them, and I appreciate the craft. And there's some ones that I have fun with. I like The Burning. I like a bunch of other ones too. But there's just something about a good, like, wintry, rural type slasher movie that really hits home for me. And My Bloody Valentine makes you care about the characters, gives you stakes in the town, has a cool as fuck costume design for the killer, really incredible production design when they're underground in the mines. It is a really great movie on all levels. And watching it for the first time in 2021, I don't understand. Like, I know that this is considered a classic, but I don't understand how this is like holy trinity of horror. That this isn't on the same level with a Friday the 13th or a Halloween, because it is just, it's incredible craftsmanship.
Agreed. I adore the original. I adore both of them. Mr. Monagle was alluding to me, the writer of Revenge of the Remakes on Bloody Disgusting, and I definitely went backwards because I saw the remake first and then I saw the original, and both are so high on my rankings on slasher lists, remakes, whatever you want to talk about. I would say that My Bloody Valentine is probably the strongest original to remake. Like, not by much. There's so many more movies we can talk about there, but I do think at this point in my life I can say My Bloodies are like the number one original remake combo.
Very nice. And
So
do you
then
have a good answer for this one? Because I'm curious what you're going to say.
I have an answer for mine, and it's not my favorite horror movie last year, but it's the one I want to highlight the most because I think it's the one that needs the biggest push, and that is The Medium. It's on Shudder. I have talked about it everywhere I possibly can at this point. If you're a Patreon subscriber, you've heard me talk about it on our videos. If you read my writing, I have included it on every listicle I can, and I do that because it is a 2-hour plus long Thai mockumentary about documentarians who go into a very traditional village in Thailand, and it is slow at the beginning. The first hour about is just building the tension and doing the groundwork with the shaman, and you feel so close to the work that she is doing, and you feel a connection with the shaman, kind of circle she's running in. And then it opens the door later for all the craziness that happens, and it's definitely a slow burn for so long. You have to stick with it. It's subtitled. I think it's one of those movies on Shudder that half of the Shudder users are going to turn off after 20 minutes because they're going to go, oh, well, this isn't scary. But that's because you have to get like an hour, 10 minutes in, and then you get the closest thing we're ever going to get to Safe Haven from VHS2, in my opinion. And that is my selling point. If you stick with it, you're going to get some real good found footage horror scares with night vision cameras and a possessed person. You're going to get some insane possession. I don't even want to say what happens later with the possession, but there's a lot of people. The cameras keep rolling. It gets gory. It gets gross. And it also gets really fucking scary. So I stick with The Medium. Trust me, get through it. And I think you're going to really enjoy it.
That's high praise too, because pound for pound, Safe Haven is maybe one of the best things the horror genre has ever produced.
Cult horror. It's just really good cult horror, and that mix that with possession, mix that with theological horror, and as The Medium, that is what it is, and I want more people to see it.
All right, go check it out. It's on Shudder.
And then for number 2, I think we're gonna do our Amelia shout out and do a little Pickety Witch talk. Because do you subscribe to the newsletter Pickety Witch? Do you follow Amelia? Do you want to hear about many things we should all be caring about in the political sphere and social activism, but delivered in a way that has funny gifts? Maybe it's Loki, maybe it's Marvel, who knows? That is what the Pickety Witch is, and I highly encourage you to subscribe because I needed it for me, myself, and it keeps me more informed and keeps me informed in a way that I can definitely, catch on to a little quicker. So that is, follow. Go find it.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully by now y'all know that Amelia's a personal friend of ours, that we think extremely highly of her as both a writer and an editor. But I think one of the best things the Pickety Witch does is it gives you a place to start. And that's kind of an underrated quality, especially if you're on social media where everything feels like the end, that we're living in the end times, that everything is impossible, that nothing matters. It's kind of easy to let that nihilism creep in. And Amelia does a really good job of not only teasing out those connections to popular culture, but also giving you a place to start, giving you the small lift, giving you the easy lift, not making you feel like the options are either to individually overthrow the Supreme Court or do nothing. That there's a vast middle grounds of opportunities to get engaged, and she's going to let you know what those are.
And that's it. Those are our 2 bumpers. We thank everyone who is part of our Patreon, and we thank everyone who gives us these little talking points every mid-episode.
Appreciate y'all. Back to the show. Hey, welcome back. So, today we're going to be talking about Alien Raiders. Alien Raiders is a 2008 horror sci fi film. It is the debut feature of director Ben Rock, who horror trivia enthusiasts may recognize as the production designer of the Blair Witch Project or the guy who created those signature stick figures. In Alien Raiders, Rock turns his hand to sci fi horror, pitting the residents of the small town of Buck Lake, Arizona, against a violent group of mercenaries whose goals may or may not be as evil as they seem. The entire film was shot in a defunct supermarket, and Alien Raiders is part The Thing and part X Files, but entirely a bunch of really fun late 2000s action sci fi goodness. So, as we always do on our episodes, Heather, first question for you is you knew that you were ushering in this brand new era of certified forgotten because we were going to let you go above 5. What made this the movie that you were like, this is it, I'm shooting my shot, I want to talk about this one?
Well, I think the biggest reason is because more people should be talking about Alien Raiders. It's funny because you mentioned the thing, and I also, for me, especially revisiting it because it's been a while since I've watched it. And I popped in my raw feed blue DVD of it, and I forgot like how Carpenter esque it feels because there's like even parts of it that feel very Assault on Precinct 13. And then I thought about the title, which is like kind of silly, and I was like, they should have called it like Assault on Aisle 13.
Ooh.
Like that would have been perfect. But yeah, I think for me, it was again, this was a movie that I covered really early in my career. And I even got to interview Ben for it. And it was funny because you talk about like the fact that most people know him as the Blair Witch guy, which for me, I actually recognized him because his wife had a short film at Sundance in 2009. And I remember him in the audience, and when I got like the press kit for it and it had his picture, I was like, "Oh my god, that's Alicia's husband." So it's
Hmm.
funny because most people like in these situations will be like, "Oh, it's somebody so and so's wife." Where in this one, I was like, "Oh, it's her husband." And then it was like, and then the Blair Witch thing like came together, and I was like, "Oh, okay." But for me, it was like it was a movie that like they sent to me, asked me if I wanted to cover it, and I was like, "Yeah, this sounds great." And I still have to this day when they sent out the DVD for it, they also sent out a container with a severed finger. And
Ah, nice.
they sent it to my work, which was really fun because I worked at a very conservative Christian company. And I think they were a little weird. They were weirded out by me sometimes. Like I actually had to take down my Sawtooth postcard I had hanging up in my cubicle because it was too graphic. And then I get a severed finger in the mail, and they were like, "What is going on?" Um, but it was one of those like I saw it and I was like, "This is really good." Like it's definitely like a low budget movie, but what I think for me, there's a lot of movies that sort of come out where they're low budget, high ambition, and I think this one really gets that right in terms of it knows its limitations and it doesn't feel sort of held back by them, but then where it needs to go big, it delivers that. And
Hmm.
it's just really fun. Like I sit there and I think about a lot of the movies that were coming out at that time, and it doesn't feel like anything else that I was seeing, in 2000s between like 2007 and 2009. And Ben Rock just rules. Like he's a really great guy, and we're still friends to this day, which is, pretty awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm glad you brought up the title so that I didn't have to, because these things are often not ultimately um, things that a creative might get to control. The title of the film, it sells a very different bill of goods, I think, than this movie ultimately ends up being. I think this movie also suffers from terrible like thumbnail syndrome, which a lot of movies suffer from, which is that the cover art, the box art on this, or at least what shows up on each of the streaming platforms you might look at it, has very little incentive to make you watch the thing. But what I was sort of surprised by is I read an interview with Rock, and he said that the budget of the film was about 2.2 million, which is more than I was expecting, but not in relationship to the quality of what I saw on the screen. It is a very polished, very good looking feature. And there are a lot of films that we've watched that have a lot more money that feel less competent on the screen. I mean, I could spend an entire podcast probably talking about just like the set dressing of the supermarket. There's a lot of love and a lot of detail that went into this. And sometimes you say that and it's a way of saying something nice about a movie you might not have anything else to say good about. But in this case, it's sort of like it's those touches of world building and authenticity, I think, that make it fun.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think too, again, it's it's one of those where it's a one location movie, which should feel smaller, but it doesn't. And for me, it was as soon as I watched it, I was like, wow, this would pair really well with Black Friday that just came out a couple months ago because they have very similar ideas, but very different execution. And I think to me, like it's one of those movies where it wears its influences on its sleeve. And I will say the other hook for me going into this too is because I was a huge 24 fan. So the fact that Carlos Bernard was in this, I was like, Tony Almeida, yes, okay. Tony Almeida and Aliens, I'm in. And I was really surprised because again, it's one of those movies like one, it was sort of interesting to watch a movie that was made how many years ago, and like the characters come in wearing face masks and like everything. Now I'm just
Yeah.
like, oh my god, when I watch things, I'm like, why doesn't somebody have a mask on? And I was like, oh look, they were doing it back then. And it moves at a clip, like it doesn't waste a single frame, like it doesn't sit down to like rest on its laurels. It's like we're going from point A to point B to point C, and we're not gonna like 80 this it's a really tight 85 minutes. And I think from start to finish, it's also kind of like a mystery too, because you're trying to figure out like who the king is, and and ultimately you
Mhm.
kind of get the stinger at the end where you're like, oh, what we thought was the king wasn't, and what's going to happen next. I actually kind of wish we would have had a sequel to it, but I don't know, exactly how the movie had done for Warner Brothers raw feed back then. But I will say, as much as I love my DVD, I really could use a Blu-ray of this
Mm.
because there was a lot that felt really dark. And I don't know if it's just because my TV also is kind of older in where I was watching it, but I was like, wow, like this could use a nice overhaul. I'd love to see a lot of 2000 movies kind of get some respect. I know we've done like
Yeah.
80s and 90s and stuff, but I think there's a lot of movies from the 2000s that need a little bit of an upgrade.
Well, I like that you brought up Carlos Bernard too, because I think one of the things that instantly is kind of fun about this is it's sort of like that guy of 2000s television, right? Because you have Matthew St. Patrick, who was in 6 Feet Under. You have Rockman Dunbar, who was in pretty much everything. Courtney Ford, who's been in a bunch of different television shows as well. So while watching it's we the way that we look at movies and think, oh, like it's got all of those guys in it. It's got all of like the Lance Henriksen's or whoever your like that guy actor is. I kind of feel like this is that for the beginning days of prestige television, because as it was going, I was like, I know that guy, I know that guy, I know that guy. And everybody who kind of had a career in television that was worth noting, but probably nobody that quite bubbled up to the point of doing like a lot of film work. It's always fun when you get to see those people get an opportunity to show their stuff.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I will say too, like even Jeffrey Lycan, I hopefully I'm saying that right. But I remember he was in oh, it was Joan of Arcadia. He was in that for like like a bunch of episodes, which I didn't watch, but my mom watched. And so at that time, like I was spending a lot of time at her place because it was like there was something going on in like her health and stuff. So I was kind of over there a bunch. And I remember him, I was like, I kind of remember this kid. But I also think he was on like he might have been like a Disney show or a Nickelodeon show too. But he's really good in this. And he sort of becomes like the emotional anchor, which is interesting because you have such big actors in this that this kid kind of comes in and sort of steals the show from them in a way.
Well, I think that's the comparison point to other titles that might try this same brand of concept. And I think where they would fault is with the cast, because on the surface, again, it's called Alien Raiders. You've said that is a pretty standard title to get you hooked that it's sci-fi action in some way. And again, in a typical indie of that nature, the acting might go second place to the practical effects, or maybe if they're not practical, whatever effects are available. And the scene where there's a little bit of gore, like that's probably going to be the standout in a film like that in any normal standard scenario that us critics might like encounter. But Alien Raiders, I'm sitting there going, okay, maybe these aren't the most well-known actors. Maybe they didn't go on to do things, and like maybe it would have done a little better with like even like a Kevin Durand type of action hero going on here and like doing some of the roles. But there's not many performances or any that I can really point to that like quote unquote struggle. Like I'm watching a film that is, whether we want to say it's competent just like visually, and as Monogle's talking about how the supermarket looked and all the detail that goes in there, I think the acting is just as stellar in the sense that it's pretty competent straight across the board. Like everyone's doing their jobs exactly as they have to. Like the action scenes have a little bit of intensity for what they can pull off. The interrogation sequences where you have the quote unquote invaders, as we'll call them, or the criminals as they're presented at the beginning of the film, basically reveal themselves to just be hunting aliens and making sure the supermarket workers aren't infected. Like everyone's playing their parts pretty damn well. So like it is just one of those really good scenarios where everything is working in functionality. Like it's all just working in the same cycle, and you just sit there going like, I've seen a lot of indies, and like they don't all go as clean as this one.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think too, like again, what really makes it sort of stand out is that it is a great character piece on top of it. And it also kind of lends into sort of what was the trend at that time, where it was sort of like the handheld footage aspects of it as well, which were you weren't seeing as much at that time, but like I don't think they knew, like they were like on the cusp of like the paranormal activity wave and things like that. But I think that sort of lends like a different feeling to it than, again, like a lot of movies, that I was seeing at that point. And to me, like again, I hadn't watched the movie in like well over 10 years at this point. And I just, for me, I was really surprised at like how sometimes you watch stuff from the 2000s and you kind of feel like they're of that time a little bit. But I feel like this is a movie you could put out now and it works just as well. Like there's nothing about it that feels aged. I mean, maybe the flip phones a little bit and paying with cash at a grocery store. But like ultimately, like there's nothing about this movie that specifically screams, "Hey, I'm from the 2000s." And again, I think about a lot of movies that were coming out at that time, and I'm like, wow, this one, Ben put a lot into it. I think it's a testament too to the crews that he was working with, that they could make the most out of that location. I kind of wish some of the scenes were lit a little bit more, only because you lose a little bit of the effects. And
Mm.
as I've been doing, stuff with like working with people or talking to people and makeup effects, lighting is everything. So I think if there's only one thing that I'd like sort of be like, oh, this could have been a little stronger, is like they should have lit those effects just a little bit more, because they're like, you look at the pictures, I think there's some on IMDb, they're freaking amazing. And if you even watch the behind the scenes on the DVD, like it's some phenomenal work that I think gets a little lost in the shadows.
Yeah, it's the shadows for me a little bit, as you were saying, because it's definitely there. I watched it. I rewatched it today for the second time. The first time I watched it, I ranked, I think it was 85 or close to 100 Christmas horror films for Slash Film, and this was one of the ones that was a new discovery to me. And the Christmas horror aspects are their ties. They're little ties that really aren't. You're not going to get the Killer Santa, things of that nature, but it's still there. So it made my list. And I just, again,
It's
I'm
set
watching it.
on December 20th. Just they say at the
It
very
is
beginning,
true.
it's December 20th, so it
Yeah.
definitely counts.
So it
And
counts.
I forgot that it was Christmas horror. So now I'm like, yes, I have something that I could go back to every December. So that's exciting.
But like, so I watched this specifically next to a lot of really shitty Christmas horror films, because there aren't a lot of ones that stand out as being primo quality. And so the first time I watched it, it's compared against these other films, and number one, it just like blew them out of the water. So I already had pretty high, I had a high thought process about it, because man, like it just played so much better. And then I went to rewatch it today. I watched it on Amazon Prime, and whatever cut they had, it's pretty clean. But then I looked at the IMDb, just as you said, Heather, and I was like pulling up clips like little pictures for a tweet. And all of a sudden I'm like, okay, these pictures on IMDb are crisp, and they show you the practical
Mhm.
effects and everything in pretty good detail. So like that did lack a little bit, but in the same respect, while the shadows are so heavy, the cinematography just is a little shaky cam too much when it goes to action.
Yeah.
Again, the action sequences are pretty minimal, I guess we'll call them, but there are some times where soldiers have to fight the king, and how that goes down is like to kind of hide the fact that the king is really just throwing people around and they're like just flying great lengths into a supermarket shelf. The camera's like freaking out. The camera's like shaking everywhere, and it's very of the 2000s. It's very of the action cinematography that we would see in something like Crank or Shoot 'Em Up or any of those films at the time. But it's just the darkness plus that makes it a tiny bit hard. So like those are the two things that stand out to me that like quote unquote would be a struggle for some. But even at that, there's so much else to appreciate elsewhere, like the practical effects that you do see. They're great. They're great. And not only that, but the film's greatest trick is it is an alien film that really doesn't feature a lot of the aliens.
Hmm.
And like the best do, it doesn't have to, because you're distracted by other elements and you actually get tricked into like thinking that you've actually seen these aliens and these invaders so many times, when really it's just kind of the end.
Yeah, they're definitely, and it's funny because once I finished, I looked up the effects guy because that's what I do,
Hmm.
and I realized it's this guy Mike Michaels, who I briefly chatted with when No One Lives came out, because I was so blown away by the human body bag gag in that movie. Where I was like, I went to the publicist, was like, I need to talk to this guy because that was amazing. And so as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh, this is the same guy. And he's worked on like everything. Like he has like well over 200, like I think it's close to 250 in terms of just effects
Damn.
credits. And he's been working in the industry since the 80s. But again, it's like one of those, like, you look at the IMDb pictures and you're like, holy crap. And again, it's not a huge budget movie, and I worked in an effects house, so I know what those budgets come in at, and you know, it's not cheap. The stuff that they were doing was not cheap, and especially when you have to like rig things and things like that. Like, the fact that they were able to do what they were able to do with this movie at that budgetary level is mind blowing. Still,
Yeah, the thing that kind of stands out to me a little bit, right, is that like we're talking about Donato, you're kind of talking about the film um, within the era, but I think that contextual knowledge is important, right? Because like by modern day standards, it feels very of a piece with a lot of mid to later 2000s kind of stuff. But if you go back and you see just how chaotic and how we can't afford to show anything, so we'll show nothing. Those films were. It really sets it apart a bit, I think, and it that kind of like within the context of the period that it came out, it really stands out as a different type of horror film.
yeah, I think especially in the wake of movies like Hostel and sort of a lot of the gore movies, people like to say torture porn. I hate that terminology with every fiber of my being, so I refuse to acknowledge that it's a real thing. And I'm sorry, but I don't think that's a real thing. Like, there was just extreme violence. It was just like America's reaction to French extremism that was coming out like in the early 2000s. So for me, it's interesting because everybody was kept pushing things and pushing things. You see it in the Grindhouse movies, you see it in Devil's Rejects and things like that. In this movie, where it has some really amazing effects, but ultimately, like you said, like the effects, you're not really showing up to watch people get slaughtered. Like, this ends up being, basically sort of this back and forth between all these different characters in terms of who's at the grocery store, these people who come into the grocery store, what is their purpose? How are these characters going to coexist? What's going to happen? Is there going to be, this onslaught of violence? What ultimately is the end goal, or where is this all going to head for, their respective groups and things like that. And I think, to me, that's what I love about it so much, is that it could have been like this crazy all out alien movie. It's Alien Raiders is its title. But I think it becomes so much more. And I think that's, to me, why I love it as much as I do, because it's got all that cool stuff, but I get hooked into all the human stuff. And that's really tough to do sometimes in sci-fi. And you mentioned that too, Matt D. I was like, wait, we got double Matts. That some of the best sci-fi movies, the things that draw you in the most to them are the human characters. And to me, again, when I think about like what was happening back then, like, this feels so understated as to where horror was, in the late 2000s. That again, it was just one of those, like, when I was going through all my, all these different movies and trying to figure out like what I want to do, it was like, this is a movie I feel like more fans, like, if social media was more prevalent in the late 2000s, I think this would have been like on the list of so many people at that time, because I think it is a really clever way of playing on tropes and things that we've seen before, but ultimately finding a new way to do them.
Yeah, it's the VOD stigma. So was this direct to VOD actually? I should ask that.
I'm pretty sure I know that it won awards at Shriekfest.
Right.
So it did, like, it played there. But I think because of the success at Shriekfest, I think Warner picked it up for their raw feed, which I'm trying to think, because also I know the effects guy worked on Otis, which I think might have been another raw feed movie as well. which is also sort of an underappreciated. It's not my favorite, but it's got some decent stuff in there. But yeah, I think it went straight to Warner's home video label at the
Yeah,
time.
and at the time, as the one thing we always talk about in this podcast often, because we're doing films from the early 2000s, mid 2000s, and the stigma of VOD and what that meant for movies that came out then that weren't discovered, and that goes along with like social media would have picked this up. I agree with that. They would have ran with it, and even just tweeting about it, like already people have been coming to my single tweet to be like, oh my god, like I missed this one, like, oh, I loved it, like stuff like that. None of that existed when it came out, and nobody wanted to really dive into VOD titles because they thought, well, you can't go to a theater, so why would it be good? And like, it just stinks for a movie like this because it would have made the list, it would have made the listicles, it would have done all that stuff if it had just had that theatrical push, but it doesn't. And so like now we're talking about it like that, like that's the hard part about these films, but it is hitting higher than some of the films we've talked about on this podcast even. And that cleanliness is such an important aspect of it. Like, it is just a very competent, talented filmmaker saying, all right, I've got this much money to get the job done, and I'm gonna get the job done as well as I can. And like they did, and that doesn't always happen. And like, it's weird to say that, but like, again, we've seen so many indie features, and the ones that get it right always have the human characters right and always have those relationships down, because that's what's driving the film, even if it is a gore film, even if it is an alien film. And the ones that kind of don't hook us and the ones that we don't talk about are the films that unfortunately would just focus on the thumb cutting off scene in Alien Raiders, or the very end, or anything that like shows an alien real quick and it's like, all right, all the characters don't matter outside of that. Like, we have characters we care about, and that doesn't happen all the time in horror.
Yeah, I will say too, like when I was doing research into this and things like that, like it made me realize, like, for as much as people sort of overlooked non-theatrical horror at that time, like honestly, that's where some of the best stuff was happening. Because like you had movies like Behind the Mask,
Yep.
you had movies like Jack Brooks' Monster Slayer, which were sort of two of my favorites of that time. And Anchor Bay was doing the Dark Lord's work at that time because they were putting out a ton of stuff. And again, Warner Brother had their raw feed. You had Dimension Extreme, like honestly, like, sure, I enjoyed whenever horror movies hit theaters, but ultimately, like, my favorite movies that came out of that specific time period, most of them never played a theater, or if they did, it was like a special screening here or there. So that's why I always tell people, like, these days when like movies go straight to VOD and things like that, like, don't let that deter you from checking a movie out. That's not an indication of quality. Because for me, it never was. But I know there's the tendency of like, well, if it's good enough, if it's a good enough movie, it should be playing on a big screen. But also the last few years have sort of switched that thinking a little bit. But yeah, I always tell people, like, look for movies where you're not, where you might least expect it, because those are the gems that I think they sort of imprint themselves on you. Movies like this, like, it's one of those, like, I never imagined some movie with the guy from Invasion, that's like a meta take on serial slashers, that has like Robert Englund basically playing Dr. Loomis, would ultimately become one of my very favorite movies of all time. But like, Behind the Mask is still endured for me. And again, that's 15, like we're talking 15 years now. I will say also too, what I love about social media is that you're going to find people whose views on movies you kind of tend to gravitate towards. So really pay attention to those folks who are trying to champion these movies and are bigger. Like, we're all going to talk about Scream 2020. We're all going to, talk about the, Black Phone when it's out, in a few months, and for good reason, because it's great. But like, pay attention to those other movies that we talk about too, because I think ultimately that's where you're going to find these gems that are going to stick with you. Because again, it's one of those, like, I think about a lot of horror movies that came out in 2008, 2009. Like, there's not a lot of movies from that time that I find super duper memorable, but we were doing this, like, Alien, like literally Alien Raiders, and like The Revenant was another one that kind of came up on my list, but I know that has like a few extra reviews because it played some festivals. So it didn't, I don't know if it quite qualified, but like, you're going to find other ways to see movies. Don't just let the theatrical, glossiness be your indicator of what the quality of that movie is. Plus also Tubi, like, and you mentioned Amazon Prime, like you could dig around in those places for hours and find some gems that like most people overlooked over the last, 20 years.
Tubi has the best horror catalog on streaming right now. Maybe next to Shutter, obviously. Like Shutter is curating it, and then Shutter has the quality hands down. But me and Monica will say it all the time on this podcast. Like,
Mhm.
Tubi might as well sponsor this podcast. It has all of the underseen stuff, all the stuff that doesn't get the attention from a Shutter or a Netflix, or the titles that aren't quote unquote important enough. They go to Tubi, and then like they're free to watch to everyone. Like, it's so amazing. And just to comment quickly on the whole theatrical thing, it's like movies made for theater have to be made a certain way to appease certain marketing, to appease certain audience demographics, things of that nature, where an indie is going to take its swings. And if it gets picked up, it gets, like, obviously they're trying to get picked up, but they can take more personal swings, and they can take a route like Alien Raiders, where they're doing things their way, and they're doing things that again, you said The Thing meets like Assault on Precinct 13 in a way, or any standoff movie or anything of that nature. It's a concept that might not have made sense to maybe some like bigger players to make it a studio film, but that's only because they have certain they're checking boxes in a certain way, and they have to make the movie that's going to make the most money, where here's a smaller budget, go do your thing, we're just going to see how this comes out. And yeah, I'm always going to gravitate towards the indies, and like that's why my like end of year list is always I'm not trying to go against the norm. I'm not trying to say things that go to theaters or like saturated or something of that nature. But year after year, my end of list is always populated by indies, and I think that's because I'm just drawn more to like the spirit of a film than what is just trying to make a good amount of money.
Well,
Yeah.
Donato,
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Matt.
well, I was gonna segue us to our last question, Heather. So I want to give you a chance to respond to what Donato said.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I do think we're really lucky in the last few years that it seems like studios, in terms of horror, are kind of getting on the page of like bringing directors in and just kind of letting them do their thing. Like something like Malignant gives me hope that studios can make weird horror movies, because again, when I was growing up, like, sure, a lot of my favorite movies were coming out of like New World Pictures and things like that, but if you look at a movie like They Live, that doesn't seem like a typical Universal Studios movie. Particularly in the 80s, it feels it feels very different. So I think we're really lucky in that regard, that we do have studios taking some chances here and there. But I also think they're working with directors who genuinely love the genre for the most part, which is pretty cool. But I will say, I don't know if you guys saw the article today, but there's like somebody wrote an article about like, why are indie movies so weird? And I'm just like, where have you been? Indie movies have always been weird. That's where the cool
Mhm.
shit happens. Like, catch up with the rest of the class. But yeah, so if anything, I like that this has sort of turned into our celebration of what makes independent storytelling so great.
And that segues nicely into my last question for both of you, which is that independent storytelling, like Alien Raiders, how does it find kind of its second life? Obviously we have fans on this podcast, both as a host and a guest, and myself as well, that would love for more people to see this movie. But what allows a film like Alien Raiders now to kind of have the reach that would solidify it, perhaps, as a cult classic?
I and again, I'm somebody who, like, I get the importance of physical media. Like I said, I pulled out my Alien Raiders DVD, even though primarily we just keep our Blu-rays out now because there's just too much stuff in our apartment. But like, so you can't beat the real thing. But I think ultimately, like, streaming is really where movies find like their second life, and fans can start to rediscover them. Like if you look at like a movie like Fade to Black, like when I was a kid, that wasn't a movie that you could easily find even at a video store when it was released. Like it was a tough movie to come across. But once Vinegar Syndrome kind of put together their release for it, and you know, and again, you have people who also sort of champion these movies, through word of mouth over the years. Like that's where I think these sort of second waves of fandom come into. Which again is one of these things where, like, if people are talking about certain movies online, and if I haven't seen them, like, I send myself email notes all the time, and then I have a little Google document of like things like, oh, make sure to look for this or that, and like 2 years ago, I think it was when Vinegar Syndrome first announced that they were pretty sure they were going to be getting Fade to Black. Like I was like, oh, sweet, and I like put on my list, like, keep an eye out, because I'd always wanted to see that. And and I think also just like digging through platforms. Like we all want to go to Shutter and we'll watch, the Argento movies, or Halloween 1, 4, and 5 are there, and guilty of throwing one of those on late night when I'm working, but like you can find some real gems in there. And I think especially they've become a really fantastic showcase for independent storytellers from all over the world over the last few years. And there's some really fantastic stuff on there if you're willing to put yourself out there. Like we all love the stuff that we're nostalgic for and that we're comfortable with and things like that. But I think if you kind of, you know, do a little due diligence in terms of these different streaming services, like I think that's the strength of them is that they give these movies a second life. And honestly, I'm really glad to hear Alien Raiders is on Prime because I had no idea.
Yeah, sorry, it is rentable on Prime. I should say that.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay, gotcha.
my bad for
For
not
years, it
clarifying
was
that.
actually on Vudu. For a long time, it was on Vudu's free list. And then, you know, it was one of those like, oh, do I go and dig up my DVD? And I was like, well, let me see if it's still on Vudu. And I was like, oh, it's not. So, you know, obviously physical media is always the best, you know, possible, you know, option because, you know, streaming is, you can only hold so many movies, I guess, unless you're Tubi, which, you know, they'll run everything. But, you know, I think if you go into streaming, you know, if you go into something like TV and just start poking around, you never know what you're going to find. I actually didn't even realize that they just added the Nightmare on Elm Street movies over there, which I was like, really? Because those were on HBO Max for like months. And then I was looking for New Nightmare. Not that I don't have the Blu-rays, but I was like, oh, this is easier because my dogs are asleep. And then I was like, wait, it's not on HBO anymore. What's going on? They also took the original Point Break away, and I was very sad. So, but the remake's on there, so just in case anybody wants to torture
Thank God.
themselves. Oh, you know, I was like, oh, good. I'm glad that's happening.
Well, I mean, my answer is going to be actually kind of the same because, as you mentioned before, Heather, there are so many 2000s horror movies now, and I think we're far enough away from their initial release. Uh, and they just didn't get the attention they deserved on their initial release. And I think they got caught in the entire stigma of being a VOD horror film or a VOD thriller that, sure, whatever, it couldn't make it to theaters, so why am I going to watch it? But you start looking at movies that we've talked about on this podcast, and like Vinegar Syndrome or something is putting out some of those 2000 horror movies. Like we're getting the re-releases from Shout Factory and Scream Factory because like I own 13 Ghosts, I own House on Haunted Hill, even though that's 1999, and those are movies that I think need to be so rediscovered and readdressed because they are so much better than some will give credit because they're just 2000 horror movies and everyone's written off the 2000s as like a wasteland of horror. Very untrue, like very untrue. And there are so many films, and Alien Raiders is one of those films that I think needs to get a solid physical release that gets the backing, that gets the fans excited again. All of a sudden, it does hit a shutter then, like some of these movies do, because they'll hit physical, they'll get the special edition release, they'll do all of the boutique stuff, and then it'll hit shutter. And I think if Alien Raiders goes to Prime, goes to Netflix, it helps, no doubt. It's on a streaming service, people will find it. But Alien Raiders is kind of like something horror fans especially are going to hone in on and appreciate, and they probably have Shutter already. So I do believe that is like that's the kind of the best route to see for Alien Raiders, because like outside of that, it has been out. It's been available. It's $2.99 to rent on Amazon, so it's not all that much money. And I think people are just really hesitant to jump into something like that. So I think it's got to get the attention that 80s and 90s films have gotten from the boutique distributors who want to re-release things. And it's time to start hitting those 2000s. And why not start with Alien Raiders?
Yeah. I mean, we were lucky to get House of Wax. So I feel like,
right.
And that was so well received. I'm like, let's just open that floodgate and let's keep it going.
Well, I think there it is. There's a path to cult superstardom for Alien Raiders, provided the distributors and the other folks in the audience that are listening can make it happen. So that is the definitive, that is the final word on all 6 Rotten Tomato star reviews of Alien Raiders. Heather, I want to say thank you so much for joining us, for making time for us. I know that this is a busy time of year for every film critic, and in particular you. So we really appreciate you stopping by the show. With festival season starting up really quickly, I'm sure people are going to want to read your reviews and the coverage that you're doing. So where are some good places for people to go and follow your writing or learn a little bit more about you online?
Oh, gotcha. So I am primarily over at dailydead.com. We also do a podcast over there called Corpse Club. And I usually show up on the episodes with my horror BFF, Patrick Bromley. And then we also do a podcast through his site, F This Movie, called Craven, where we have been doing deep dives into Wes Craven's entire filmography. So that's been super fun. I also do some stuff over at fangoria.com. And you can also find me over at on Twitter at The Horror Chick. So for in terms of the writing stuff, you can find Monsters Makeup and Effects Volume 1 over at amikpublishing.com. It's also available at Barnes & Noble, Amazon. You can even order it off a Target, I just found out a couple weeks ago, which is kind of weird. But yeah, so that's available now, and Volume 2 will be out, I believe, sometime this summer.
Donato, what you got, man? It's festival season for you too. Go ahead and share where people can follow your writing.
Oh, we're gonna take a Sundance off. We had a big year last year. We're gonna sit through Sundance, and I'll be back at it for South by. But you can find me as always at Donatobomb on Letterboxd, Twitter, and Instagram. You can follow my writing. You can follow my pictures. You can follow whatever you want. You can also hit my Authory. I have this nice little page on Authory.com. Search Matt Donato, and it compiles all of my writing in one easy to find place because I don't think you want to sift through Slash Film, Fangoria, Bloody Disgusting, IGN, and everywhere else I write.
And as for myself, you can find me on Twitter at Matt Monagle, Monagle. And yeah, please, if you haven't already, or if you're not in the habit of doing so, check out www.certifiedforgotten.com. We are lucky enough to have a lot of really talented and interesting writers who are sharing some unique perspectives on films. We recently had a piece on The Village as an allegory for school shooter drills that really deeply changed how I think about that movie. So if you want to know kind of what the best bubbling young horror critics are, I'm biased. I think a lot of them are writing for certifiedforgotten.com right now. So check it out and make up your mind for yourself. And that is it. That is our show. Heather, again, thank you so much. And our future guests, thank you for the new territory and new roads that you paved for us in our review requirements.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me again. Really, it's been a pleasure and an honor, and I was so thrilled to do this. So I really do appreciate you giving me a chance to chat about a fun movie, and even myself, which is weird, but I appreciate it.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Donato, you got a plethora of options here. How are you taking us out?
Fucking dildos.
Traditions. You got to have.